President Hoover. So you've just looked at some podcasts on the American Depression, and now you need to know, how did they start trying to pull themselves out of it? Well, the answer is pretty simple. They get rid of President Hoover. So in the election of 1932, Hoover went up against President Roosevelt. And to find out more about him, just look at the podcast after this on Roosevelt. So as I've said before, President Hoover completely did not believe in government intervention. He thought that people should be able to pull themselves out of the Depression. But the problem was there was no jobs to get, so this was impossible for people in America to do that. They would have loved to have done that, but it just wasn't possible for that to be able to happen. So people in America had mocked Hoover. They talked about Hoovervilles, they talked about Hoover blankets and Hoover leather, and the farmers even said, in Hoover we trusted and now we're busted. And they were absolutely right. So it's important for you to focus, if you get a question about Hoover and Roosevelt, all the mistakes that Hoover made and all the positive things that Roosevelt actually did during the Depression to try and help turn things round. So let's focus in then on Hoover. Hoover is a Republican president, and the Republicans completely and utterly believed in people helping themselves. It was called a laissez-faire government. They didn't believe you need to get involved in people's lives. And Hoover constantly talked about rugged individualism. And what he meant by that is that people should be able to work hard and pull themselves out of any difficulties that they're in. And to be able to get the best grades on this, you need to understand why he believed that. When Hoover was 8 years old, he was orphaned, so both his mum and dad had already died. And he was brought up by an uncle who instilled this in him. And what he did was he worked for $1 a day in various different jobs. And then he went and became a mining engineer. So he became very rich from the work he'd done out in mining in Australia. And when he came back, he was a self-made millionaire. So he genuinely believed that he pulled himself out of that difficult situation so everybody else could. But what he was forgetting in the Depression in America was actually there wasn't any jobs for people to get. So he absolutely believed in letting people just get on with it themselves. But he failed to realise that people did need some help during the American Depression. People had got sick, basically, of what had been happening. And something that really, really annoyed them was just before the election, 3 months before the election in 1932, his treatment of the bonus army. The war veterans from World War I were promised a bonus in 1945 for fighting in the First World War. Because the Depression though had got so bad, they realised they wouldn't live until 1945. So in 1932, they went to the White House and they made a big Hooverville just outside the White House. And they stayed there and they hoped that all the protests they were doing would make Hoover give them the bonuses now instead of waiting until 1945. Hoover did not do that, and even worse, he set the National Guard on them. So ultimately, the Hooverville was burnt down, 1,000 people were injured, and 2 war veterans actually died. A reporter said at the time it was political suicide for Hoover, and he couldn't have been more right. Because what would happen is people would see that, and there's no way doing that to people who fought in the war for America, people would want to vote Hoover back in. And there was plenty of reasons anyway why they didn't want to. They called him the do-nothing president, and they couldn't have been more right. And when he did realise that an election was coming up again and thought, oh, I best do something to look like I'm trying to help here, he decided he'd put money into building the Hoover Dam. But the irony of all that was, he started that in late 1931, and poor Roosevelt had to finish off that and pay for it all, because obviously he shouldn't have been starting those things really when he knew he'd be coming up for another election. He also did cut taxes a bit, so that was something, but unfortunately it was all too little too late. He started to try and put these things in place because he knew that an election was just around the corner, but for years he hadn't really been doing anything to help the American people. So when they went to the polls in November of 1932, it was absolutely obvious who they would choose.